On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. So our our third speaker for this panel is McKenzie Wark from New School of Social Research in New York. McKenzie is someone who I've been reading for years, gotten to know relatively recently. There's a new book called Beneath the Streets, which is a history of Situationists International. And Ken is really one of a generation of theorists whose, I think, careful attention to the activation of historical and recent theoretical traditions, plus an attention to the most pertinent new technical trends, is one that starts with a kind of cultural criticism and it quickly elevates to a really genuine theoretical program and problematic. He's also a careful critic of the ideas of networks as inherently benign and the politics thereby. So Ken is a theorist of media and new media with interests in media technology, intellectual property, computer games, new media art and culture. He's the author of A Hacker Manifesto, Gamer Theory, and recently, as I mentioned, Beach Beneath the Streets, History of the Situationists International. He's the chair of the Culture and Media Studies, and I guess until recently, Associate Dean at Eugene Lang College at the New School of Social Research. And I think we're ready to go. So with that, let me also make one other thing, is that the panel, which will be happening after this thing, will be moderated by Joshua Kaufman, who from Harvard Graduate School of Design, and Joshua was someone who, when we were first putting the idea of the center together, when I first arrived here at San Diego, came down and thought through a lot of the really fundamental issues with here as well. So I'm really very grateful for Joshua to come out for Cambridge from this as well and to be part of this now that the work that we set in motion has flowered as it has. So, McKenzie Wark.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you for the invitation. I hate PowerPoint, so I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to show stuff that lives on my hard drive. I was just jotting down thoughts in relation to the previous two panelists. I love the Metahaven thing, but my thought was, must we speak the hideous language of our century? And where would we find another one? And my thought for James was, I've been reading a lot of Charles Fourier recently. He had this, and this is so hard to grasp for those of us who were raised on social constructionism, but he had this idea that the whole of what he called civilization was based on utterly unsustainable social structures that were contrary to human nature. And I just sort of think, yeah, I'm fine with that. And one could read what he called the phalansterie, which was both an architectural and a social utopian space, as actually solving this problem. It was networks of networks. So you'd have affinity groups that would actually, he doesn't say 150, but he had a small number for that. But the question is then how you relate them to each other. And that was the whole point of the social universe that he designed. And it's like, well, that seems to me to be a better place to start, than, those, I suspect those little think tank pamphlets that Metahaven produced actually do exist somewhere. We just haven't seen them. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about stuff that's from my new book, Beach Beneath the Street, the everyday lives and glorious times of the Situationists International, because I wanted another language than the language that we're starting to speak, the hideous language that is of this century. And another way of thinking about the built form that is alleged to exist, that is, if you like, the infrastructural dimension to this world that we inhabit. This is a factory town in China, which looks exactly like factory towns in the British Isles, in a previous century, just on a bigger scale. Or, a little bit of, I'm sure Norman Klein's got this image in his database somewhere. It's the kind of factory sublime, the kind of endless repetition. But is that not a great image? And just another version of it. This is where cell phones are kind of constructed. Now, what I want to I want to make the slightly counterintuitive claim is that I do not believe this landscape is plausible. I do not think this landscape actually even exists. I don't think this is a possible world, this one that we're inhabiting. So the problem is to construct one that might be equally as plausible as this one that we take to be real, but which I suspect is not. Real is one of Ben's kind of interesting themes, I think. I just don't believe that any of this world is real at all. But you would say, like Dr. Johnston, but I refute it thus. I strike it with my hand and it's there. And it's like, well, it's there now, but in terms of geological time, we're living through an eye blink. There's no sense that this is necessarily something that could go on. So let's start somewhere else. This is playgrounds designed by Aldo van Eyck, wonderful architect. He built hundreds of these, mostly in Amsterdam, most of which don't exist anymore because it would never occur to anybody to preserve playgrounds as sort of astonishingly brilliant, important built forms. They're all kind of wonderfully abstract. And the person I wanted to talk about today is Constant Neuenhuis, utopian, quote-unquote, architect/artist whose famous work New Babylon is something he worked on pretty much continuously throughout the 1960s and then just completely abandoned at some point. No one knows why, but I have this hypothesis that he was building a landscape for a species and he sort of decided we weren't that species, that it would actually require aliens to inhabit. But I think that's a slightly pessimistic conclusion, and there might be things about it that are in fact quite possible. This is the famous design for a gypsy camp. It was all had sort of movable partitions. It's obviously not a terribly quote-unquote realistic architectural model, but this was how he started to think about New Babylon. And by 1967 he's kind of built and just endless kind of models of this thing. And it was all built out of perspex and bicycle spokes and stuff like that. And he did drawings later, as Mark Wigley has established. He would build the things and then figure it out later. He had collaborators with the building. And the other thing I love about this photograph is the leather vest, which just screams 1967. Of course, he was a member for Wildlife Situations International. It's work that's not unrelated to the experience of psychogeography, which might be a little dated, but one might try to think about what are the contemporary analogues of that. Where does one experience time and space in such a way that you would, in that Ernst Bloch way, go, this is the utopian moment that we want to construct the rest of life around. That was, in a sense, what the Derive through the streets of Paris was designed to do. From these temporary and fleeting moments, you would construct the beginnings of an experience of what kind of landscapes would generate the possibility of new kinds of situations. I've actually used this map in Paris, and some of it still works. Paris has, of course, changed a lot in half a century. But you'll actually notice, when you put this next to the Plan Paris, the things that are missing is kind of important. There's not a single police station ends up anywhere on this particular version of it. Simon Sadler's done some really quite detailed stuff on exactly what's in this thing. We always take it as a visual image, but it's not. It's a real map. It's a real map for thinking about a space. So, Constant built New Babylon. I'm sorry that's as dark as it is. Let me see if I can... Yeah, I don't know why. Built this thing, and then he would assemble the sectors together. He made movies of it. There's a film. It has certain design principles that I think are kind of interesting for a different kind of infrastructure for the world to come, if you like. And a lot of people look at this and go, there are several common reactions to this. One is, well, it's not possible. And I've already sort of answered that in advance. This world we're in is not possible. What is your problem with not possible worlds? We're in a not possible world. So that's my answer to that. The second is, oh, it's so monstrous and huge and totalitarian. It's like, you're in a huge, monstrous, totalitarian world. It's called infrastructure. We just don't pay any attention to it, right? We're surrounded by, giant facilities to make water and power and the movement of physical things possible. We don't think about that. Most thinking about what other social forms would be tend to gravitate towards the mid to micro scale. And what's kind of unique about Constant is he thought about macroscales. How would you think about a different macro architecture for another way of life? Here we have two dimensions. Norman mentioned spatial stratification as a classic device for thinking about modernity. And Constant kind of took that to the limit, and here you've got superimposed the infrastructures that are all built on pilotis. They're all space frame structures suspended over the whole of the planet. So the surface of the planet is either for transport or we just leave it alone. So the whole of the planet can go back to being, if you like, it wouldn't be a national park, it would be a global international park. Leave it how it is, and we'll build up above it. And this is where you start to think this is actually more about conceptual architecture, an architecture for concepts than necessarily a proposal for built form, because the factories were supposed to be underground. So we're going to bury all of that underneath the ground. There's a transport layer, and the whole space of the surface of above that, raised above the planet, is for play. Automation will make work unnecessary. So how would you create an architecture that's not based on the division of labour, the division of time between work and non-work time, etc., and that would be, if you like, in a certain sense, self-configuring. So interestingly, these are images of an end state that results from that process. He calls these things sectors. Each of those little chunks is, roughly the size of half of Manhattan. I've got a little scale exercise later. I'll show you if I get time. Now, that's the macro scale. The micro scale, he was never very detailed about. The interesting thing about the way Constant thought is it's a kind of reverse realism. The problem with most attempts to do realism, either in the visual arts or literature, is it's very, very good at the small-scale detail, and it gets very, very vague when you get to the larger structure. What's astonishing about, say, something like Balzac is that you get these sudden, very clear images of very, very large-scale social organisation, but he's mostly dealing with small, social networks, in fact, is what he's writing about. Constant actually inverts all this. He's very, very clear about macrostructures, but not about what would fill them. In a sense, that's left to his species. Whether the species could be us or not is another question. He called them Homo ludens. But whether Homo sapiens can be that species is a kind of open question. But anyway, this is the labyrinth that would sort of exist within the macrostructure. And that's about as clear as it ever gets as to what this space of play might be like. It always reminds me of nightclub architecture. Constant invents nightclub architecture without knowing it, in about 1960. And you go to the meatpacking district now and it's kind of like, oh, there it is, Each sector would have its own ambience. If you didn't like it, you'd go to another one. It's all internally reconfigurable space, so you can kind of construct whatever you like within it. It's an entirely 100% artificial environment. And this is the part I really love to kind of stress about it. There's nothing sort of eco-friendly, go to the French countryside and bang the rocks together about Constant whatsoever. He's totally embraced the fact that the future of the species is to do with artifice. It's the construction of environments. And you get the sort of spatial sense of the separation. It has to be conceived, in a sense, over and against whatever we then take nature to be. Kind of useful thought, because I got to tell you, artisanal cheese is not going to save the planet. It's not going to happen like that. He also builds them in such a way that they start to look like distributed networks. There's no power law distribution of centre and periphery in the way Constant thinks the networks ought to happen. And what that sort of presupposes is that, in a sense, property and power is being disaggregated. These things extend over the entire surface of the planet. They completely ignore borders. And you might think, gee, that's sort of just ridiculously utopian, would never happen. But it's like, well, number one, we did actually completely spatially reconfigure the entire planet in 50 years, just not in the way he imagined. Utopias always come true in reverse. Right? There's always some bit that's reversed, but all of them have always come true. There's no such thing as a non-implemented utopia. They are all actually completely real. It's just what he has here is a network diagram that doesn't actually apply to physical built space. Because we didn't abolish property, and automation didn't make work unnecessary. So the two conditions for this particular utopia did not happen. I've got to say, I'll talk to Republicans when there's no longer a ruling class. So until that time, it's us and them, baby. So the conflict model, I'm sorry, I'm still with that. I don't feel an obligation to talk to the enemy. Just a few more images. Now, it's based on space frame design systems that started, World War II is where they come from. They start to get implemented as, sort of commercial systems after the war. It's interesting to me that it's Megastructures all based on tension rather than compression. It's not building massive things out of concrete, although there are concrete pilotis. It's very much about this kind of the tensile strength of steels is how he kind of imagines it. And we're up above. We, if you like, move up and leave that space free. He puts little helipads on the top. There's an idea that you could, construct another network. He's very, very clear, and he's a reader of Norbert Wiener already in the 50s, that one of the conditions of possibility of this is a distributed network for communication. So he's already sort of thinking about what is the spatial consequences of distributed networks of communication. He's thinking about that, by the late 50s, and that strikes me as a pretty insightful thing to start to do. Now, as I say, we did actually physically redistribute space on a planetary scale, just not in this way, but it's because of that distributed network that the factory can be in China and the design shop is in, let's say, Amsterdam and so on, and will coordinate the movement of containerized traffic. He's kind of imagining that in reverse in the middle of the last century. I'll just throw up a few other pictures. I think I've got the basic stuff I wanted to get out. There's a kind of nice sense of the sort of how it would work as elevation. He never draws the factory dimension of it. There's not a single image that shows you what the actual underground factory kind of part. There's a whole mythos to do with what's buried and so on that he sort of taps into kind of unknowingly. It also has its kind of sinister dimension. This is something I think he was really fully conscious of. There's someone who spent the war in Amsterdam and was in bombed out German cities just after the war and so on. Was fully aware that, war is a form of architecture in reverse. He'd kind of witnessed that. He was well aware that Albert Speer had in fact buried factories during World War II. That this was, in some sense not completely impossible, even though I think the main thing is a kind of conceptual architecture he's trying to get us to think about. Now, I got curious about one thing with Constant, which is that, I think I only have the Paris one. He imagined what it would look like superimposed on Paris, Amsterdam and Barcelona, are the only three cities I'm aware of where you would take actual maps. And it's not random, like there are particular places in the city. In fact, that map of Naked City sits right in that middle bit there. So he's building this over the parts of Paris that he doesn't think you necessarily have to pay that much attention to. But he never did it for a city I've ever spent any time in. He never did it for New York City. And I always kind of wondered what it would look like to kind of superimpose New Babylon onto the space of New York. And I worked with an architect called Ali Dur on trying to think about what that would have been like. And our first problem was to figure out scale. It just took a little bit of measuring. And so, Constant's sector laid over the middle of Manhattan. This is roughly to give you a sense of the scale he thinks these sort of things ought to be built on. So you can see a New York City block, in relation to it. They're actually roughly the size of New York City neighborhoods in the space of Manhattan, which strikes me as perhaps not entirely coincidental. So it gives you some idea of what it would look like. I was asked by my friend Carl Skelton to build something in a project he was doing called Betaville, which I won't launch because I'm not actually on the web at the moment. Betaville is a space within which you can produce design proposals for, at the moment, downtown New York and the city of Bremen. Other maps could be added. It's just a question of putting in the map. And the idea is it's a sort of shared space for the sort of social creation and discussion around architectural projects. Because the thing is, New York City, we've just had, the Ratner organization propose a remodeling of the whole of downtown Brooklyn. Now, that's a, multi-billion-dollar investment. So, they don't stint on the amount of a sort of design weaponry you apply to persuading people that that's a good idea, right? But it's kind of hard to argue with that. I have to confess I'm generally in favour of massive megastructural developments. My father was an architect, so I was brought up with this sense of, there's not a lot of built form that's really all that good, so let's just erase it and start again. To me that's really not such a bad idea. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the Ratner project or mega projects in general, but you want to have spaces where you can have conversations about them, and it's very, very difficult for publics to do that, right? We don't really have the tools, you don't really have access to the kind of expertise. So Betaville was to kind of create a space where you could do that. It models all of the city blocks in downtown Brooklyn, downtown Manhattan. You can navigate around it. It's like any kind of fly-through. And any kid who can use 3D Max can build something and stick it in there and see what it looks like. It's open to the public. So I was asked to contribute something to it, and what I decided to build with the help of Ali Dur was New Babylon, and what we called New Babylon, to sort of get a sense of what that would be like. Because much as I love Carl's project, there's a sort of ameliorative sense of where design goes with this stuff. It's kind of like, let's put some tiny little park in that little corner there. And it's, well, fine, because that's kind of impossible, But it's like, well, if it's impossible to do these tiny little projects most of the time, why should we not propose massively impossible projects as a way of having conversations about infrastructure? So that's downtown Brooklyn. There's our version of New Babylon extending through it. The bottom image is a map to give you some sense of one laid on top of the other. This has ended up being massively controversial in the discussion threads inside Betaville itself. And that's what the city would look like as you see it through. We had to figure out height too. It's one thing Constant's never clear about. Because you've got maps, you can figure out the size in relation to plan, but what the height of these things would be is never actually really clear, because he very, very rarely puts built forms together with his own constructions. But it's like, yeah, I'd love to kind of inhabit that, and we'd have a nightclub up on that floor, and the bar would be over there, and have a view of the city, and you kind of cut through at about the 40, 50 story level. Of course, if anyone's been to New York, there's a sense in which I think of New York as the oldest modern city. There are some others you could put in that category. You go to London, it's all retrofitted, yeah? It's a very, very old city. I remember I went to Groningen for its 900th anniversary, which to someone from the New World was almost unthinkable. But everything's retrofitted on top of it, whereas New York City, it just starts modern. That's how you get the street grid and all that sort of stuff. So, what would it be like to retrofit that with a whole other infrastructure that you could build on top of it? That would be, if you like, a different concept of what infrastructure would be that then makes possible other forms of life within it. Because my question is, why do we not think, laterally about the infrastructural scale anymore? If you think of, sort of futurist architecture, it's already doing some of the stuff Constant will do later. But this is, to me, it's kind of like the last project that sort of works on that kind of scale. And of the three, I think, really great utopian proposals that come, if you like, after rather than before Marx, this is the only one of the three that's not on Mars. The other two are Bogdanov and Kinstanley Robinson. Just sort of do it on a whole other planet where you've got, it's not a greenfield site, it's a redfield site, if you'll pardon the gag. But Constant was the only one that thought about doing it actually on Earth. And actually the way he does it is he builds a kind of second deck for the entire planet. It's like, in suburbia, when you have the second kid, you build the next story up, There's literally, he thought overpopulation, the only way we'll deal with it is build a second deck for the entire planet, and put everybody up into that particular structure. Part of the charm of it is he actually thought that this planet was a kind of infrastructure that would support this, and we now know that kind of really not to be the case. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is a model for what built form could be. But it is a model for thinking about, and this actually brings us back to Fourier, because it's the same kind of process as Fourier. Let's just take all of the design language that we already have. You don't need to invent anything new. But play out the language laterally and metaphorically to find out what other kinds of structure are possible within the given languages we already have, to then start thinking about what conceptually possible architectures might be on the scale of the geopolitical, so that one can then view the one that we actually have in that negative light. So it's a kind of thinking tool for firstly seeing what is actually there, but secondly for viewing it as one instance of a possible set of which it does not have necessary priority in terms of reality. So I shall leave it there. Thank you, Ben. Thank you.